This lecture is about a specific technique for contextual text mining called contextual probabilistic latent semantic analysis. In this lecture, we're going to continue discussing contextual text mining, and we're going to introduce contextual probabilistic latent semantic analysis as extension of PLSA for doing contextual text mining. Recall that in contextual text mining, we hope to analyze topics in text in consideration of context so that we can associate the topics with appropriate context that we're interested in. So in this approach, contextual probabilistic latent semantic analysis, or CPLSA, the main idea is to explicitly add interesting context variables into a generative model. Recall that before, when we generate the text, we generally assume we'll start with some topics and then sample words from some topics. But here we're going to add context variables so that the coverage of topics and also the content of topics will be tied to context. Or in other words, we're going to let the context influence both the coverage and the content of a topic. The consequence is that this would enable us to discover contextualized topics, make the topics more interesting, more meaningful, because we can then have topics that can be interpreted as specific to a particular context that we're interested in, for example, a particular time period. As extension of PLSA model, CPLSA mainly does the following changes. Firstly, it would model the conditional likelihood of text given context. That clearly suggests that the generation of text would then depend on context, and that allows us to bring in context into the generative model. Secondly, it makes two specific assumptions about the dependency of topics on context. One is to assume that depending on the context, depending on different time periods or different locations, we assume that there are different views of a topic or different versions of word distributions that characterize a topic. And this assumption allows us to discover different variations of the same topic in different contexts. The other is that we assume the topic coverage also depends on the context. And that means depending on the time or location, we might cover topics differently. And then again, this dependency would then allow us to capture the association of topics with specific context. We can still use the EM algorithm to solve the problem of parameter estimation. And in this case, the estimated parameters would naturally contain context variables, and in particular, a lot of conditional probabilities of topics given certain context. And this would allow us to do contextual text mining. So this is the basic idea. Now, we don't have time to introduce this model in detail, but there are references here that you can look into to know more detail. Here I just want to explain the high-level ideas in more detail. Particularly, we're going to explain the generation process of text data that has context associated in such a model. So as you see here, we can assume there are still multiple topics. For example, some topics might represent the themes like a government response, donation, or the city of New Orleans. Now this example is in the context of Hurricane Katrina, and that hit New Orleans. Now, as you can see, we assume there are different views associated with each of the topics, and these are shown as view 1, view 2, or view 3. And each view is a different version of word distributions, and these views are tied to some context variables. For example, tied to the location Texas, or the time July 2005, or the occupation of the author being sociologist. Right? Now, on the right side, you see now we assume the document has context information. So the time is known to be July 2005, location is Texas, etc. Now, such context information is what we hope to model as well. So we're not going to just model the text. And so one idea here is to model the variations of topic content in different contexts. And this gives us different views of the word distributions. Now on the bottom, you will see the theme coverage or topic coverage might also vary according to these contexts. Because in the case of a location like Texas, people might want to cover the red topics more. That's New Orleans, as visualized here. But in a certain time period, maybe a particular topic like donation will be covered more. So this variation is also considered in CPISA. So to generate such a document with context, we first also choose a view. And this view, of course, now could be from any of these contexts. Let's say we have taken this view that depends on the time in the middle. So now we will have a specific version of word distributions. Now you can see some probabilities of words for each topic. Now once we have chosen a view, now the situation will be very similar to what happened in standard PISA. We assume we have got a word distribution associated with each topic, right? And then next we also choose a coverage from the bottom. So we're going to choose a particular coverage, and that coverage before is fixed in PISA, and it's tied to a particular document. Each document has just one coverage distribution. Now here, because we consider context, so the distribution of topics or the coverage of topics can vary depending on the context that has influenced the coverage. So for example, we might pick a particular coverage. Let's say in this case, we've picked a document-specific coverage. Now with the coverage and these word distributions, we can generate the document in exactly the same way as in PISA. So what it means, we're going to use the coverage to choose a topic, to choose one of these three topics. Let's say we have picked let's say the yellow topic. Then we'll draw a word from this particular topic on the top. Right, so we might get a word like government. And then next time we might choose a different topic, and we'll get donate, etc. Right, until we generate all the words. And this is basically the same process as in PISA. Now, so the main difference is when we obtain the coverage and the word distributions, we let the context influence our choice. So in other words, we have extra switches that are tied to this context that would control the choices of different views of topics and the choices of coverage. And naturally, the model will have more parameters to estimate. But once we can estimate those parameters that involve the context, then we will be able to understand the context-specific views of topics or context-specific coverages of topics. And this is precisely what we want in contextual text mining. So here are some sample results from using such a model, not necessarily exactly the same model, but similar models. So on this slide, you see some sample results of comparing news articles about Iraq War and Afghanistan War. Now we have about 30 articles on Iraq War and 26 articles on Afghanistan War. Now in this case, the goal is to review the common topics covered in both sets of articles and the differences or variations of the topic in each of the two collections. So in this case, the context is explicitly specified by the topic or collection. And we see the results here show that there is a common theme that's corresponding to cluster 1 here in this column. And that there is a common theme indicating that United Nations is involved in both wars. It's a common topic covered in both sets of articles. And that's indicated by the high probability words shown here, United Nations. Now, if you know the background, of course, this is not surprising, and this topic is indeed very relevant to both wars. If you look at the column further, and then what's interesting is that the next two cells of word distributions actually tell us collection-specific variations of the topic of United Nations. So it indicates that in Iraq War, United Nations was more involved in weapon inspections, whereas in Afghanistan War, it was more involved in maybe aid to Northern Alliance. It's a different variation of the topic of United Nations. So this shows that by bringing the context, in this case different wars or different collections of text, we can have topic variations tied to this context to reveal the differences of coverage of United Nations in the two wars. Now similarly, if you look at the second cluster, cluster 2, it has to do with the killing of people. And again, it's not surprising if you know the background about wars, or the wars involve killing of people. But imagine if you are not familiar with the text collections, or you have a lot of text articles, and such a technique can reveal the common topics covered in both sets of articles. It can be used to review common topics in multiple sets of articles as well. Now, if you look down, of course, in that column of cluster 2, you see variations of killing of people, and that correspond to in different contexts. And here is another example of results obtained from blog articles about the Hurricane Katrina. Now, in this case, what you see here is visualization of the trends of topics over time. And the top one shows just the temporal trends of two topics. One is oil price, and one is about the flooding of the city, New Orleans. These topics are obtained from blog articles about the Hurricane Katrina. And people talked about these topics, and in addition to some other topics. But the visualization shows that with this technique, we can have conditional distribution of time given a topic. So this allows us to plot this conditional probability to generate curves like what you're seeing here. We see that initially the two curves tracked each other very well. But later we see the topic of New Orleans was mentioned again, but oil price was not. And this turns out to be the time period when another hurricane, Hurricane Rita, hit the region. And that apparently triggered more discussion about the flooding of the city. The bottom curve shows the coverage of this topic about the flooding of the city by blog articles in different locations, and it also shows some shift of coverage that might be related to people's migrating from the state of Louisiana to Texas, for example. So in this case, we can see the time can be used as context to reveal trends of topics. This is some additional result on spatial patterns, and in this case it's about the topic of government response, and there was some criticism about the slow response of government in the case of Hurricane Katrina, and the discussion now is covered in different locations, and these visualizations show the coverage in different weeks of the event. And initially it's covered mostly in the victim states in the south, but then gradually it's spreading to other locations. But in week 4, which is shown on the bottom on the left, we see a pattern that's very similar to the very first week on the top left, and that's when again Hurricane Rita hit the region. So such a technique would allow us to use location as context to examine variations of topics. And of course, the model is completely general, so you can apply this to any other collections of text to reveal spatial temporal patterns. Here's yet another application of this kind of model, where we look at the use of the model for event impact analysis. So here we're looking at the research articles in information retrieval, or IR, particularly SIG-IR papers. And the topic we are focused on is about the retrieval models, and you can see the top words with high probabilities about this model on the left. And then we hope to examine the impact of two events. One is the start of track for text retrieval conference. This is a major evaluation effort sponsored by US government, and it was launched in 1992 or around that time. And that is known to have made an impact on the topics of research in information retrieval. The other is the publication of a seminal paper by Croft and Punt. And this is about the language modeling approach to information retrieval. It's also known to have made a high impact on information retrieval research. So we hope to use this kind of model to understand impact. And the idea here is simply to use the time as context and use these events to divide the time periods into a period before the event and another after this event. And then we can compare the differences of the topics, the coverage, and the variations, etc. So in this case, the results have shown that before track, the study of retrieval models was mostly a vector space model, Boolean model, etc. But the after track, apparently the study of retrieval models have involved a lot of other words that seem to suggest some different retrieval tasks though. So for example, email was used in the enterprise search tasks, and subtopic retrieval was another task introduced later by track. On the bottom, we see the variations that are correlated with the publication of the language model paper. Before, we have those classical probabilistic model, logic model, Boolean model, etc. But after 1998, we see clear dominance of language model as probabilistic models. And we see words like language model, estimation of parameter, etc. So this technique here can use event as context to understand the impact of event. Again, the technique is general, so you can use this to analyze the impact of any event. Here are some suggested readings. The first is a paper about the simple extension of PLSA to enable cross-collection comparison. And it's to perform comparative text mining to allow us to extract common topics shared by multiple collections and their variations in each collection. The second one is the main paper about the CPLSA model with a discussion of a lot of applications. The third one has a lot of details about the spatial temporal patterns for the Hurricane Katrina example.